Francis Scott Key was a respected lawyer living in Georgetown, just west of where the modern-day Key Bridge crosses the Potomac River. The house was torn down after years of neglect in 1947. He made his home there from 1804 to around 1833, with his wife Mary and their 6 sons and 5 daughters. At the time, Georgetown had a thriving population of 5,000 people just a few miles from the Capitol, the White House, and the federal buildings of Washington. But after a war broke out in 1812 over Britain's attempts to regulate American shipping and other activities while Britain was at war with France, all was not tranquil in Georgetown. The British had entered Chesapeake Bay on August 19, 1814, and by the evening of the 24th of August, the British had invaded and captured Washington. They set fire to the Capitol and the White House. The flames were visible 40 miles away in Baltimore. President James Madison and his wife Dolly and his entire cabinet had already fled to a safer location. They were in such a hurry to leave that they had to rip the Stuart portrait of George Washington from the walls without the frame. A thunderstorm at dawn kept the fire from spreading. The next day, more buildings were burned, and again a thunderstorm dampened the fires. Having done their work, the British troops returned to their ships in and around Chesapeake Bay. In the days following the attack on Washington, the American forces prepared for the assault on Baltimore, which had a population of 40,000, and they knew that it would come by both land and sea. Word soon reached Francis Scott Key that the British had carried off an elderly and much-loved town physician of Upper Marlborough County, a Dr. William Beans, who was being held on the British flagship Tonant. The town people feared that Dr. Beans would be hung. They asked Francis Scott Key for his help, and he agreed and arranged to have Colonel John Skinner, an American agent for prisoner exchange, to accompany him. On the morning of September 3rd, Key and Colonel Skinner set sail for Baltimore aboard a sloop flying a flag of truce which was approved by President Madison. On the 7th, they found and boarded the Tonant to confer with General Ross and Admiral Alexander Cochrane. At first, they refused to release Dr. Beans, but Key and Skinner produced a pouch of letters written by wounded British prisoners praising the care that they were receiving from the doctor. The British officers relented, but they wouldn't release the 3 Americans immediately because they had been witness and they had heard too much of the preparations for the attack on Baltimore. They were placed under guard, first aboard the HMS Surprise, then onto the sloop and forced to wait out the battle behind the British fleet. Now, let's go back a year to the summer of 1813, just for a minute. At the star-shaped Fort McHenry, the commander, Major George Armistead, asked for a flag so big that the British would have no trouble seeing it from a distance. 2 officers, a commodore and a general, were sent to the Baltimore home of Mary Young Pickersgill, a maker of colors, and commissioned the flag. Mary and her 13-year-old daughter Caroline, working in an upstairs front bedroom, used 400 yards of best quality wool bunting. They cut 15 stars that measured 2 feet from point to point. 8 red and 7 white stripes, each 2 feet wide, were cut. Laying out the material on the malt house floor of Claggett's Brewery, a neighborhood establishment, the flag was sewn together. By August, it was finished. It measured 30 by 42 feet and cost $405.90. The Baltimore Flag House, now a museum, occupies those premises, and it was restored in 1953. At 7 a.m. on the morning of September 13th, 1814, the British bombardment began, and the flag was ready to meet the enemy. the bombardment continued for 25 hours, with the British firing 1,500 bombshells that weighed as much as 220 pounds and carried lighted fuses that would supposedly cause them to explode when they reached their target. But they weren't very dependable, and they often blew up in midair. From special small boats, the British fired the new Congreve rockets that traced wobbly arcs of red flame across the sky. The Americans had sunk 22 vessels, so a close approach by the British was not possible. That evening, the cannonading stopped, but at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 14th, the British fleet roared to life, lighting the rainy night sky with grotesque fireworks. Key, Colonel Skinner, and Dr. Beans watched the battle with apprehension. They knew that as long as the shelling continued, Fort McHenry had not surrendered. But long before daylight there came a sudden and mysterious silence. What the three Americans didn't know was that the British land assault on Baltimore, as well as the naval attack, had been abandoned. Judging Baltimore as being too costly a prize, the British officers ordered a retreat. Waiting in the pre-dawn darkness, Key waited for the sight that would end his anxiety, the joyous sight of General Armistead's great flag blowing in the breeze. When at last daylight came, the flag was still there. An amateur poet, and having been so uniquely inspired, Key began to write on the back of a letter he had in his pocket. Sailing back to Baltimore, he composed more lines, and in his lodgings at the Indian Queen Hotel, he finished the poem. Judge J.H. Nicholson, his brother-in-law, took it to a printer, and copies were circulated around Baltimore under the title Defense of Fort McHenry. 2 of these copies survive to this day. It was printed in a newspaper for the first time in the Baltimore Patriot on September 20th, 1814, then in papers as far away as Georgia and New Hampshire. To the verses was added a tune, Anacreon in Heaven. In October, a Baltimore actor sang Key's new song in a public performance and called it the Star-Spangled Banner. Immediately popular, it remained just one of several patriotic airs until it was finally adopted as our national anthem on March 3, 1931. But the actual words were not included in the legal documents. Key himself had written several versions with slight variations, so discrepancies in the exact wording still occur. The flag, our beloved Star-Spangled Banner, went on view for the first time after flying over Fort McHenry on January 1, 1876, at the Old State House in Philadelphia for the nation's centennial celebration. It now resides in the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of American History. An opaque curtain shields the now fragile flag from light and dust. The flag is exposed for viewing for a few moments once every hour during museum hours. Francis Scott Key was a witness to the last enemy fire to fall on Fort McHenry. The fort was designed by a Frenchman named Jean Fontaine and named for then Secretary of War James McHenry. Fort McHenry holds the unique designation of National Monument and Historic Shrine. Since May 30th, 1949, the flag has flown continuously by a joint resolution of Congress over the monument marking the site of Francis Scott Key's birthplace, Terra Rubra Farm, in Carroll County, Kemar, Maryland. The copy that Key wrote in his hotel on September 14, 1814, remained in the Nicholson family for 93 years. In 1934, it was bought at auction in New York from the Walters estate by the Walters Art Gallery for $26,400. The Walters Gallery in 1953 sold the manuscript to the Maryland Historical Society for the same price. Another copy that Key made is in the Library of Congress. Narrator's note. The following is the often controversial last stanza of Key's poem. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. The hirelings and slaves Key referred to in the last stanza of his epic poem were the British sailors and naval officers engaged in the battle against the American people. Many ill-informed folks insist he was referring to Africans held as slaves at the time. As much as liberals believe this to be true, Key wasn't referring to blacks held in slavery in his poem's last stanza. This is basic reading comprehension. The subject of his poem was the American flag still flying over Fort McHenry after 25 hours of assault by British cannon fire, a sign of America's victory over the British naval fleet, not Africans captured by other Africans as a result of tribal wars and traded for commodities such as firearms to slave traders from Europe and the Middle East. He was celebrating America's victory over the British at the Battle of Fort McHenry. Because the British Navy found it difficult to man its many warships, it implemented the controversial practice of impressment, basically forcing merchant sailors from Britain as well as other countries into service in the British Navy. These men were essentially slaves. Their paltry pay was customarily withheld for a minimum of 6 months to counteract desertion, at least for 6 months. These were the slaves he was referring to. The hirelings were the British naval officers. Key, in his last stanza of the poem, expressed his joy at seeing the star-spangled banner still flying over Fort McHenry in the early dawn hours of September 14, 1814. It represented victory for the Americans. Sources state that this stanza was written after Key was released and back in Baltimore, at which time he would have discovered that the British gave up the battle and retreated because British victory would have cost too many British lives, thus the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave. Expressed in contemporary vernacular, the following is the stanza. The bravery of our patriots battling the superior numbers of the British naval fleet forced them to turn tail and retreat because nothing could save the naval officers, the hirelings, and the unfortunate bastards forced into service for the British Navy, the slaves, from either the terror of flight or death if they were foolhardy enough to continue battling our patriots. And so our flag waves above Fort McHenry in triumph because we kicked ass and put the fear of death in them, and they sailed away like the pussies they are. I hope that clears it up.